And we are live. Hello, everyone. This is My Two Cents, and welcome back to your weekly COVID-19 update. I'm joined right now by Filthy Heretic and Night Shift 10,000. Looks like SO will not be joining us again this week, so sorry about that. But let's open, as we always do, by discussing where exactly the U.S. national debt is. Well, taking a look at debtclock.org, U.S. national debt is currently $25,268,614,000,000, and it's about to crest up to $615 million as we speak. Up there it goes. Meanwhile, the Fed's balance sheet this week is just shy of $7 trillion. This week in particular, the Fed purchased $178 billion in mortgage-backed bonds. Mortgage-backed bonds in particular makes you think of the 2008 financial crisis.
I mean, it's exactly what happened in the financial crisis. You had a whole bunch of mortgage lenders who were forced, mind you, into giving out mortgages to people who they know will be unlikely to pay it back. That's why the category subprime mortgage existed. It meant that they weren't going to be paid back probably. And so in order to continue to get banks to make more of these mortgages, you have the government going in and buying up the bad mortgages so that banks would have more money with which to make more loans. Mm-hmm. And of course, all that really did was encourage more of this bad behavior, encourage more of these bad loans to be taken out. And because it was now directly profitable for banks, for mortgage lenders, whoever, to just get mortgage-backed securities, they became predatory in a sense to try to get people into taking up mortgages they couldn't afford. After all, the mortgage would just be bought up by the Federal Reserve, by Fannie and Freddie, by Congress, by whoever. And this very much simply compounded the problem and exaggerated it. Now, with the Federal Reserve doing this now, it makes total sense that there is some kind of moral hazard at play, likely in relation to the everything bubble that it has been inflated since the burst of the 08 housing bubble. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, we're not going to know exactly what the details are until after the fact, but yeah.
I just want to say I cannot wait to see the effect that all of those loans defaulting has on the economy. I just cannot wait to see what happens there, because it's going to be gargantuan, and it's just going to show the full failure of what is going on right now. And people will probably shrug it off saying, oh, it was the rich people's fault, or oh, it was someone else's fault. But no, it's on the government, it's on the Federal Reserve, and it's on all of these banks that issued loans that people are not going to be able to pay back. And it's just going to be colossal.
I mean, I can already tell you that people are not going to recognize the cause of the burst of the everything bubble for what it really is. There's going to be a big push to make the narrative about some political enemy. Usually it's the free market. You see, we just didn't have enough regulators. We simply didn't have enough restriction. The problem is that you were just too free. And if we just enslaved you a little bit more, then everything would have been just perfect. And unfortunately, we know with absolute certainty that a decent chunk of the population, I couldn't give you a proportion, but a very large chunk of the population will buy it hook, line, and sinker, or at the very least internalize some of those narratives. Now, that said, I'm not really concerned about that all that much, because I understand that what people generally believe doesn't entirely matter in terms of the main driving force behind how society organizes itself.
Mm-hmm. Now, the thing to keep in mind is that right now, the Federal Reserve and Congress are doing everything they can to try and stop people from defaulting, because the bubble bursts effectively when everyone starts defaulting on all these bad loans. When one person defaults, that means the creditor to whom they default doesn't have the money they were counting on. That creditor, potentially then defaults to whoever they are in debt to, and the whole thing falls apart like the big chain of dominoes that it is. Which, of course, brings us to the $3 trillion HEROES Act that was passed by the House of Representatives late this Friday. Remains to be seen if it will go through the Senate or not. And of course, President Trump always could veto it. The bill has been criticized all throughout the media, praised by some facets of the media, criticized by others. But it is a $3 trillion bill, primarily providing money for state and local government relief, but also containing in it provisions for another round of stimulus checks, specifically $1,200 for eligible adults. But with payments for dependents, for example, $500 per child, bumping all payments up to include dependents, including children under 17, which brings it to a total of possibly $6,000 per family. And incidentally, although the payments right now are simply at $1,200 per adult, the discussion has been had. I know the Democratic Party in particular wanted to give $2,000 a month to every adult in the United States and define adult as anyone 16 years old or older. So, and of course, the narrative being we've just got to, in this time of crisis, we've got to continue helping to make sure that every person has everything they need. But of course, the Andrew Yang, if everybody remembers him, the former Democratic presidential candidate, whose whole campaign was about starting a universal basic income, a freedom dividend, as he called it, of $1,000 a month to every American. Well, they're now proposing $2,000 a month, and he has come back in the spotlight to talk about how the coronavirus is actually highlighting just how important it is that we institute a universal basic income. And there are those saying that this is just a temporary measure. We all know that there is nothing more permanent than a temporary government program. And once the American people have learned to depend on these monthly checks, there is no way you will ever get rid of it.
That's pretty much going to be a guarantee. Not to mention that all this talk about how healthy the economy was. Any healthy economy does not need $2,000 a month check. Normally, like, people used to be able to afford what they needed fairly easily. The thing is, though, it's like the government has, for the last 100 years or so, had a monopoly on the dollar, which has consistently causes prices to inflate. It's gotten to the point now where people just assume that inflation is normal, when in fact throughout most of American history, prices continually inflated very, 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 very slowly. Even during the height of the the gold rush in California, there was very little inflation. The dollar has lost like over 99% of its value since the Federal Reserve Act.
And specifically since 1971, when the last vestiges of the gold standard were destroyed.
I mean, that's the point. Like, you can look at any graph that compares cost of living to real wages. You can find that, like, for the most part, since they started keeping track of it, like, it wavered here and there. But the cost of living in the United States and real wages kind of rose with each other. They were generally like very close to each other, but at that very moment when the Bretton Woods Agreement was canceled completely, that was when it just flatlined. Cost of living continued to go up, real wages went up. Sure, people's wages went up, but that's why I specified real wages, because real wages take into account things like inflation. And the fact of the matter is, like, people aren't getting raises at the cost they need, at the rates they need to, be able to support themselves. Not to mention that all of the artificial shortages that are created by government intervention into literally every aspect of the economy, making everything more expensive at every level of production and creating artificial scarcity where there otherwise wouldn't be, basically makes it so that not only is it harder for people to get jobs, it restricts the employment opportunities and entrepreneurial opportunities. It also makes the goods and services that they would otherwise have access to significantly more expensive.
And that's the thing that I don't understand how so many people are missing this. But again, if people aren't working, then goods and services are not being produced. If goods and services are not being produced, then the things when you go to the store or you shop online, you'll discover that the things you want to buy aren't there. And that when there's a smaller supply of the things you do want to buy, the prices of those things are going to go up. So in fact, the more government borrows, quote unquote, borrows money to send checks to Americans who aren't producing any goods and services, the faster people are going to realize that goods and services aren't there, and prices will, and that inflation will just hit that much harder. I actually, my video, I have a video coming out tomorrow that's really a back to basics video about universal basic income yet again. But that's the thing. Money, again, is a medium of exchange. Well, actually, let's distinguish that. But I shouldn't be saying that. Let's say currency, the U.S. dollar, which is appropriately should be called currency, not money, is only maintains its value in as much as it actually represents real goods and services that people want to buy, which simply are going to be in shorter and shorter supply the longer people are not actually out of their homes creating the goods and services that everyone wants.
What's interesting is that the way people are talking about this as well is, well, at least troubling, at least to me. So what I see is a whole bunch of people who are discussing like, oh no, the amount should be the monthly check should be 2,000, no, 6,000, no, 1,000, no, we shouldn't be doing this at all. And you would think that the right way to respond to that is we shouldn't be doing that at all. And while that is while that is consistent, what people aren't talking about is why is this the case at all? I mean, you and I and presumably our audience knows, but I think if they were to start going down that rabbit hole, they would start to find some very unpleasant implications, which is, of course, why you're not going to be seeing on the media. You know what I've been seeing on the media, and in particular Fox News lately? You know what the topic that everyone's been talking about?
Oh, God, what?
Michael Flynn.
Of course.
Yes, I can vouch that Fox News, yes, has been talking quite a bit about Michael Flynn.
Who the heck is that? What has he done? Who cares?
No one.
I mean, I get that I get that the Obama administration was engaged in actions that basically amounted to entrapment of a government official for entirely political reasons. But honestly, this comes off to me as like you know how in the later days of the Roman Empire, how there was basically a civil war every week.
Mm-hmm.
It just a manufactured crisis to keep people's attention.
Oh yeah.
I don't know if it's manufactured per se, but I think what it is that it's a spectacle, and it's entirely a power grab on the part of a small faction of the priesthood of statism, which is entirely consistent with how priests of statism act when their civilization is in decline. Well, they'll just try to grab for power by any means necessary, using whatever tools they have at their disposal. In the later days of the Roman Empire, where, as I said, there was a civil war every other week, you had politicians who doubled as generals in the Roman legions, and they would basically sick the legions that were under their direct command at each other in order to, seize power. And I think this is what the Obama administration was trying to do as well, to try to hold on to power, to make sure that it was Obama's cronies and Obama's friends and Obama's appointees that remained in place for whatever reason. Obviously, they wanted to enrich themselves to the extent that they are able to with the resources that they have. And I think at some point there's a kind of urgency that didn't exist before, where they may not be consciously aware of it, but they understand that the jig is up. The empire is finished, and we got to get what we can for ourselves right now. It's effectively unconsciously shortened / heightened their time preferences, and as such, well, yeah, they're going to be acting. There's going to be a continuing number of tiny civil wars that are going to be emerging from this. This is very symptomatic of the late stage Roman Empire. And I think if you look at other great civilizations or so-called great civilizations, at the moments of their decline, that you would also see like similar actions where rulers would, or rather would-be rulers, would use whatever machinations and means necessary to try to grab onto and hold on to power.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Just quick, thank you to Pumpkin Row for the super chat. Who is ready to see massive inflation from this legislative fiat? Also, could everyone on the stream take turns saying genocidal maniacs, please? Say the words genocidal maniacs.
Genocidal maniacs.
Genocidal maniacs.
Okay, I'm not exactly sure where you're going with that, Pumpkin Row, but thank you for the super chat.
I can tell you actually. Last stream, Pumpkin Row fell in love with the way I say those words.
Nice.
Yeah. Actually, so, anyways, continue.
I want to suggest something. Here's the thing: they could still do like the $1,200 checks to everyone, or the $2,000 payments a month. But instead of printing more money, could it be just a gigantic tax refund to the people? Basically, cancel all government spending, cancel everything that the government's doing, and just give it as a massive tax refund to the people of the United States. Just give them back their money in the form of something like that, or just give all the money back to us and let us spend it the way we want to spend it. Because
you're just a little early, Night Shift. I do think that is coming. What I can say with, again, the policies, they're trying to stop people from defaulting on their loans. And if you look more closely at for example, the Fed buying all these mortgage-backed bonds, they're trying to, and all the talk about cancel rent and ensuring that people with mortgages don't have to pay the mortgage on the mortgage for their primary residence. They're trying to keep the people from defaulting because that is deflationary, and that will set off the economic crisis. Now, this can only go for so long. They can't, because as we know, the laws of economics show that the more they print money, the more they pump it into the economy. The only thing that can occur is hyperinflation. Now, not wanting that to take place, I think eventually the defaults will start to happen, and initially that will be deflationary. People will start default as people start defaulting on their loans. Prices will begin to drop. Everyone's going to pull in their horns and stop spending, and that is when, in desperation, the Federal Reserve will do something like that and say, all right, screw it, give back every American all the taxes they've ever paid in their lifetime, send currency to everyone. We have got to start people spending, and we've got to stimulate the economy. Of course, when they do that and all the saved, quote unquote, saved currency that they've been printing finally comes out of hiding, that is when the real hyperinflation hits. And I know historically, if you look at hyperinflations that have taken place, it usually is, in fact, preceded by deflation followed by a harsh hyperinflation.
That's always fun, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you would think that deflation would be a good thing.
And it is. It's good savers, to the consumers, but it's it's bad to of course, for stock prices and corporations. So,
which seems to be the entirety of their ambition right now, just to prop up the stock market, prop up banks, prop up the big institutions. It seems to me like that's their primary motivation, their goal right now. And I'm trying to remember off the top of my head why that's so important to them. The obvious explanation is because that's where their friends have their money. That's where they have their money. That's where their friends work. And as such, they very much want to keep them happy because they have, for lack of a better term, a class interest. I'm not talking about class interest in terms of the bourgeois. I'm talking about class interest in terms of the political ruling class, the way that, SEK3 meant it.
Yeah. And come to think of it, for all these pundits who talk about, we care about the common man, ensuring that he has everything he needs. How are rising consumer prices good for the common man? Sure, they might be good. It might be good for the stock market. It might be good for corporate stock prices, but higher consumer prices, in fact, hurts the common man, as the common man is the one who has to spend the majority of his money on those consumer prices. falling consumer prices would in fact be a good thing for the common man. It's just not good for the corporate overlords who mysteriously the government trashes all the time, but then is oh so desperate to save in times of crisis.
It's a pound of
Exactly.
flesh. They pretend to want to go after the corporate overlords, but they're going to be perfectly happy to. They're going to be perfectly happy to go along with it, get along, go to their events, fundraising, do all that stuff. They're railing against them just makes good sound bites for the presidential election. There's really not much more to it.
Mm-hmm.
Although it's funny because whenever deflation is barely, if ever, mentioned on the news, but when it is, it's considered to be the absolute worst thing ever. Whereas nowadays, it's like I don't remember where I saw this article on. It was mainstream. I can't remember if it was CBS or NBC or CNBC or something. But they said that how it worked was basically how the Federal Reserve has figured out how to do responsible inflation.
Oh yeah,
What?
how could inflation? When you really understand what inflation is, how could anyone possibly think inflation is a good thing? The expansion of the currency supply so that everyone's money becomes worth less. And whatever 2% inflation rate is what they consider to be optimal. We want inflation to occur at 2% every year. Great. So every year, every American loses 2% of the purchasing power of their savings. How could that possibly be good for anyone? And the answer is it's not good for anyone except the issuers of money, because inflation is a transfer of wealth from the people to the government. And in fact, it's a regressive tax in as much as it disproportionately hurts the people who have the least amount of money.
Well, the idea behind getting a 2% is part of modern monetary theory. With what they want to do is effectively inflate their way out of debt. Where imagine that you have $10,000 of credit card debt and an income of $15,000. $10,000 is going to be a lot of money, right? You're going to be spending a lot of your income on just the interest payments. Now imagine that your income increases to $150,000. Suddenly, that $10,000 in debt doesn't seem very large, does it? The Federal Reserve is very much trying to do the same thing in regards to inflation. This is what proponents of modern monetary theory propose: that you can have a level of inflation that allows the government to inflate its way out of debt without increasing prices too much, which is not the definition of inflation. The definition of inflation is increasing a monetary supply. So the idea that they can somehow prevent that is absolutely ridiculous. But that said, what they're trying to do is basically get the United States to where their tax revenue is around, say, 50 trillion a year because of how much they've inflated the monetary supply, and the US debt is 30 trillion. So suddenly it becomes a lot easier to pay off. That's what they believe will happen. Now, will that actually happen? No, of course not, because modern monetary theory is basically Keynesianism, but taking all of the not as terrible parts out of it and then making it worse.
Mm-hmm. The Achilles heel, of course, being real supply and demand. You can print as much money as you want. You can add as many arbitrary steps between the Treasury and the Fed as you want. You can implement this tax or this regulation or that regulation, but the government cannot create real resources out of thin air. Real wealth is only created by people making voluntary transactions and finding ways to produce the goods and services that everyone wants at cheaper costs than they could before. No matter what the government does to try and manipulate that process, it can't actually make real goods and services appear, and ultimately supply and demand wins out.
Well, the government has always had a hate-hate relationship with supply and demand. It's one of their, as far as I'm concerned, it's one of their biggest blind spots.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I don't even know if it's a blind spot. They probably just don't care. Everything that they do is motivated by power and power alone. So,
exactly. And on that note, another thing to discuss. Who's ever shopped at J.C. Penney? It's one of the biggest clothing retail outlets there is. Well, it seems that as of this Friday, J.C. Penney has joined the ranks of a number of other retail outlets, to include J. Crew, who have declared bankruptcy. Does that mean J.C. Penney is going away completely? Not necessarily, but they will be closing at least 800 stores amidst the years of mismanagement that they were already dealing with, which were problems that have been exacerbated by the fact that they've been forced to close many of their stores. But one thing that I think is worth mentioning when it comes to J.C. Penney and many of these other large corporations that have been forced to shut down is that when we get back to how President Trump and others were asserting that this was the strongest economy the world has ever seen, and then in a matter of weeks, the coronavirus shutdown has put millions of people out of work and caused these large corporations to go under. One thing that actually would indicate that the economy is healthy is the amount of real savings held by individuals and by businesses. In theory, if you are in times of prosperity, if your income is very large, you want to save some of that income because you never know what the future holds. There could be, an economic upset, be it a natural disaster, war, something else, but there are always unexpected things in the future. And if you plan properly and save your income, then even when these hard times strike, you have enough resources saved that you can sustain yourself for a long period of time and then reopen or go back to business as normal when the crisis has passed. But that's not what really is taking place. Businesses and individuals were living effectively paycheck to paycheck, loan to loan. And when that's the way you're doing business, it only takes one upset to completely cause the whole thing to collapse. Well, why is it that these giant corporations don't have the necessary real savings to deal with a crisis like this? It just proves that they were not doing as well as everyone thinks they were.
They like to put forward a pretty face, but that's largely just to keep their shareholders happy. Now, I remember me and Esso in our stream, we were talking about the retail apocalypse this time last year, where every week there were like thousands of retail closures. I haven't been to the mall in a while, but the last time I was there, it was like half of the booths were shuttered.
Yep.
So this kind of thing has been going on for well before then, and I'm pretty certain that all the coronavirus has done is, I'm convinced all the coronavirus has done has accelerated the process that was already going on by a couple years.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Turning into the straw that broke the camel's back. I can tell you that much.
And if you look like this past September, there actually were hints that an economic collapse was coming. And of course, the Fed stepped in and stopped it with their expansionary monetary policy and expanding their balance sheet. But then the coronavirus came. So again, it was inevitable. It's bound to happen. And the longer they hold it off, the worse the crash is going to be. But it just goes to show that there is nothing that there is absolutely nothing they can do to stop it at this point. They're only, by continuing to print money, by continuing to buy assets, by continuing to send checks to Americans, all they're doing is delaying the inevitable and making sure that it'll be that much worse when people finally realize, oh crap, this money is worthless. Oh crap, there's nothing on the shelves.
It's kind of amazing how the only reason that companies would be doing so poorly is because of all the central planning that's happened, especially in the medical industry. Only the government can make a hospital go bankrupt during an epidemic.
Yeah, as though they weren't going bankrupt prior to that.
Gee, I wonder what could have caused that too.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's actually kind of funny how I always laugh whenever states come over to me and say, well, you just blame the government for everything. Name one thing the government's not involved in. I dare you.
And funny how the things the government are the two industries in the United States that are probably the most heavily regulated are the banking sector and the healthcare sector. Well, look at the state of each.
Nuclear power.
I'm sorry?
You forgot nuclear power, which is also another example because there hasn't been a new nuclear power plant built in 40 years. I'm pretty sure one got approved, but I haven't been following the state of it.
All right. Well, moving on to our next topic. I don't know if anyone's been to their local grocery store lately and seen how much meat there is, but I know amidst Twitter, Facebook, and all the other social media sites, there are now a lot of pictures circulating of people who have gone to their local grocery store and taken a picture of the meat section because it is completely empty. Well, what's happening to all the meat? We discussed it on last week's stream, and I think the stream before that. But of course, many meat processing plants around the nation have been forced to shut down due to a high level of coronavirus infections. There was an article. I have an article here from the Wall Street Journal that basically says that JBS USA Holdings Incorporated, which is one of the biggest beef producers in the United States, has had to hire as many as an additional 1,000 workers per plant just to do the amount of necessary cleaning and wiping down of equipment that they are now required to do as a result of COVID-19, amidst they're already being shorthanded with workers who are being forced to stay home due to infection. And the country is, as every passing day and week goes, more and more of the country is starting to feel the impact of having less meat. So I know this is worse in some places than others, but it is a real food shortage that does not appear like it'll be getting better anytime soon.
So it begins.
Well, yeah, not to mention that once again the government is involved. Who would have thought? Yeah. I mean, it's illegal to drink milk straight from the cow, so you kind of have to send it to processing centers, and you got to get it pasteurized. You got to get a whole bunch of other things that I can't recall off the top of my head because I'm not an expert on these supply chains. But that said, I am almost certain that there's going to be some regulation that basically requires it to be sent to some meat processing facility, as opposed to, I don't know, just slaughterhouses doing everything themselves and then just handing it directly to either retailers or just selling it themselves.
Yeah, it's funny how in a free market, when there's demand for something, local producers actually start to produce it, and it directly incentivizes people who weren't in the industry to jump into the industry, start making more of whatever it is people want, and lo and behold, supply and demand brings the balance back. But when you throw in the Food and Drug Administration or some other agency that's responsible for certifying whatever it is, it takes forever to produce more of everything of what people want. And by the time they do, demand has already shifted. So then you have you go from a shortage to a surplus to a shortage to a surplus over and over again.
It yo-yos.
And that's a good thing. And more importantly, you need prices to be able to figure it out. The problem is that as soon as this crisis started, the government cracked down very hard on price gouging. Price gouging is a good thing. It is meant to signal to producers, yes, these things, there's not a lot of them. And if you have these in supply, you can sell them here and you'll make a crap ton of money. In so doing, you alleviate the shortage. You cause prices to return to normal. And in some cases, you can actually create a surplus in an emergency situation. Imagine that.
Yeah.
I mean, honestly, in any healthy economy, the absolute destruction of supply chains of food would cause prices to skyrocket. Yeah, it would suck for a lot of people, but it would also encourage people to get into agriculture, to get into food production, and it would eventually cause the prices to stabilize again. This isn't difficult. It's not complicated.
I mean, the question is, what do you really want? Do you want it to suck really bad in the short term, but have everything be normalized relatively quickly, or have everything be awesome, quote unquote, awesome in the short term, and then suck for a really long time? Because that's effectively what happens. If prices shoot through the roof, yeah, it sucks for some people in the short term, but it also allows the supply and demand mechanism to start working. Suppliers get the hint, and before long, everybody has the things they need at reasonable prices. If you pass laws against price gouging, everybody celebrates as they go to as they stock up on as much as they can of the good and service at or service at the artificially low prices, and then in a perpetual shortage, no one has what they need for a very long period of time.
Exactly.
All of it entirely by design.
Oh yeah.
I mean, I'm pretty sure that there is some power play at work that is encouraging politicians to act the way they do. Probably because democratic politics in general is entirely meant to be appeasing, just meant to keep the plebs happy so that there isn't a popular overthrow of the government.
As the Romans so famously said, give the people bread and circuses.
Pretty much.
Oh yeah.
And
And
as a result,
that's a good transition to the next thing we were going to talk about, and that is, of course, COVID-19 restrictions in various states. Some states throughout the United States are fortunate enough that they're beginning to open back up, but not people in states like Pennsylvania, California, Michigan. Now, Michigan in particular, everyone knows Gretchen Whitmer, the totalitarian governor of the state of Michigan, and potential VP running mate for former Vice President Joe Biden, has said this Wednesday that the protests that are occurring in her state, this is from thehill.com, Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer said Wednesday that the lockdown protests are, quote, racist and misogynistic, and called on all those with a platform to discourage the demonstrators. The article continues. Whitmer told ABC's The View that protests are, quote, really political, as demonstrators have brought nooses, Confederate flags, and Nazi symbolism. This is not appropriate in a global pandemic, Whitmer said, but it's certainly not an exercise of democratic principles where we have free speech. This is a call to violence. This is racist and misogynistic.
Yep.
So people are showing symbols that they don't like, allegedly. I haven't seen the protests, so I can't verify one way or another. I have a feeling that she actually didn't see anything. Maybe someone came with a Confederate flag. Maybe. I don't know. But I sincerely doubt someone came with actual like Nazi imagery, like a Nazi German flag or swastika or anything like that. But that said, yeah, they have a tendency to make that kind of crap up.
Yeah, exactly. It's
of course.
I'm willing to bet that nothing like that actually happened. That nobody came there like that. She's just trying to do a general discouragement of any kind of what they would call dissident activity, and it's complete BS. It's just complete BS. They're trying to downplay the problem, and it's not going to work.
Well, here's what I think. I think she's actually trying to come up with a justification for doing like what's his name in de Blasio in New York City did, where they just straight up banned protesting. I wouldn't be surprised if that's coming soon. She's trying to do that.
And I'll just say, I obviously have not seen these protests aside from a few video clips and pictures, so I can't say for sure. This is just me speculating. But it would not surprise me if Whitmer's own government planted protesters with these symbols just so that they could then point them out and basically scapegoat them into making protesting illegal. Because as she said, protesting, she has to acknowledge, is protected under the First Amendment, but calls to violence are not. Rational solution: implant your own people in the protesters, have them show racist, vile symbols, whatever you have, and then thereby claim therefore, because one guy in the crowd had a swastika flag, therefore all the people in the crowd condoned his actions and want to overthrow the Michigan government and institute some kind of Nazi regime. Therefore, we can outlaw protesting altogether.
You can literally hire people. You can literally hire crowds to protest or demonstrate whatever you want. Like,
and that's exactly what everyone remember the 2016 election, how George Soros organization paid thousands of people to protest in the streets throughout the United States.
Yep.
Let me just try to find a name of one of those crowds for hire firms. There's a big one. Here's one. Crowds on Demand. They basically, if you want your place to look as big as possible, either for PR demonstrations or just political events, or even just to protest a thing you don't like, or have 1 or 2 or 3 or 10 people show up with offensive paraphernalia, they go in there, they hold signs that they probably can't read because they don't speak English at all. And then, they get paid $100 or something. And not to mention that there's screenshot after screenshot after screenshot after screenshot after screenshot of Craigslist advertisements for professional protesters and that sort of thing. Yeah. So it makes sense that if they were there, I mean, even then, like, this raises the question, like, what if this didn't happen and this was a genuine Nazi who genuinely flew it because reasons, I don't know. We're at a point now where everything is so heavily politicized that you can't believe your lying eyes. This is the late stage Soviet Union where you can't watch the news because otherwise you'll just go crazy. Everything, like, you can't believe what you see and you can't believe what you hear. And in a sense, you're kind of forced to be isolated in a little bubble where everything has to be heavily filtered. Everything has to be seen through a lens. Sure, it may be distorted, but since everything is distorted, it's the only way you can really make sense of the world.
Yep, good old COVID 1984.
Mm-hmm.
Very, very much so.
Now, I know in the state of California, they've gotten particularly strict about wearing a mask when you go out. In fact, there are reports that individuals are being arrested for being in a car outside their home, not wearing a mask. So that, again, to reiterate that, you are in your privately owned vehicle by yourself outside your home, and if you are not wearing a mask, you can be arrested. All the while, dangerous criminals are being released from prison because they might spread COVID-19.
I mean, it's kind of funny. If you're a rapist, if you're a murderer, if you're if you're a pedophile, you're going to get released because because you're going to get released because otherwise you'll get COVID-19. But if you protest, if you show up at a public park when you're not supposed to be there, if you do something the government doesn't like, well, we're just going to throw you in jail. It's to protect you from COVID-19.
Mm-hmm. You know, Ryan McMacken over at the Mises Institute had a great article earlier this week, basically pointing out that police everywhere love to enforce petty crimes. Why? Because the people they are enforcing the crimes generally are not dangerous. They're law-abiding citizens, so they just go along with it and take their citations and pay them. When the police are dealing with dangerous criminals, those guys are actually likely to fight back, and they might walk away with a black eye. So they're more inclined to turn a blind eye to those kind of things. So it's not surprising at all that police love to enforce stupid petty crimes like not wearing a mask in public, but completely don't care about violent criminals.
It's going to be the same thing with you can see the same thing in Europe too, like in the UK, where police will go out of their way to hunt down people who post mean things on Twitter. But if you're a Muslim grooming gang who are kidnapping and raping little girls and putting them into sex slavery by the thousands, we'll just pretend that didn't happen. You're
we
a racist.
all know we might get called racist or Islamophobic if we do anything about it.
Or conspiracy theorists.
Again, it certainly was a conspiracy, just not a theory.
Right.
Mm-hmm. I have to wonder if, like, among several of these governors, if they just have a competition going for who can get the strictest with their lockdown regulations before the people finally rebel.
I mean, I've had people who are telling me that as well. That it definitely seems like they're trying to compete with each other, like who can be the most restricting, who can have the most totalitarian measures. And the theory that I've heard put forward, I'm not sure I agree with it, but this is just the theory that's put forward that, that they're competing to political office, that they're trying to, if not get a nomination during the DNC convention by the super delegates, then they're trying to angle for a VP position, for a Secretary of State position, Secretary of Commerce, Secretary of Interior. Basically, they want to try to get into the Joe Biden administration because, I mean, let's be honest, Joe Biden is so senile. You could probably convince him of anything with...
For goodness sakes, he's falling asleep during his interviews on TV.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, it's beautiful.
Yeah.
Also, I can't help but notice something that's been going on in the comments. Servius says, screw the economy. That's very difficult because everything is economics. Everything comes down to economics. And quite frankly, I think economics has been the most important factor, has been the most important driving factor behind history. So, I mean, just an example. Politics. All politics ever. Politics is a subset of economics.
It's about the control of resources.
It's everything is entirely about the scarcity of goods and services and figuring out how best to allocate them. And what politics does is politics is the science of distributing scarce resources using violence. So the idea that you can just ignore the economy or just say screw the economy is fundamentally ahistorical and completely ignores, well, material reality.
Yep.
And no, it's not about spirit and drive. You can't measure those things. You can't quantify those things. Spirit and drive are also entirely economic factors as well, because people are generally going to have spirit and drive to achieve material wealth and well-being in their self-interest according to whatever that they can achieve materially, which of course is a factor of, say it with me now, economics.
Mm-hmm.
Pumpkin Rose says, I don't think there's any spirits in politics. You have to sell your soul to be a politician.
Yes, this is completely true. Politicians are evil. Prove me wrong. And no, there is nothing, and I'm sorry, Servius, but there is really nothing more to it. There's nothing more to politics other than economics. And the subset of economics called politics is entirely unethical.
All right, I think we'll go ahead and cut off that conversation there.
Sure.
All right, at this point, we're getting into the last 15 minutes of the stream, so if there is anything anyone wants to discuss in the chat, go ahead and put that up there now. Otherwise, let me quick check and make sure I didn't have any other articles I wanted to discuss on this stream.
Well, there is something that I haven't really looked into this article, but there is a thing about how the EU is threatening to sue Germany for threatening the bloc. I need to read over this real quick.
All right, you're referring to the article from express.uk?
Yes, that's the one.
Okay, so the title, all right, so this, for those interested, express.co.uk. The article is called EU Threatens to Sue Germany as Furious Row Risks Endangering Bloc, warns top judge. The European Union would be plunged into crisis if the bloc attempts to sue Germany over its top court's controversial ruling on the European Central Bank, one of the country's leading judges has warned. So Peter M. Huber, who has drafted the German Constitutional Court's opinion, said a legal challenge against Berlin would trigger a significant escalation, potentially tipping Germany and other member states into constitutional conflict that would be very difficult to resolve in the long run. It could weaken or even endanger the European Union. Germany's top court last week ruled that the government and the European Court of Justice had failed to properly assess the European Central Bank's asset buying program. The ruling by the Karlsruhe-based court disregarded a previous ECJ ruling on the issue. Okay, so what that sounds like is the European Central Bank, much like the Federal Reserve, buys assets in order to expand the supply of euros and to prevent people from defaulting on their debt, to stimulate economic growth and a number of other reasons. But the Federal Reserve allegedly, and I guess the European Central Bank allegedly, has limits on what it can buy. The Federal Reserve, for example, is not supposed to buy actual stocks. And to this point, it hasn't bought actual stocks. I know they're not supposed to buy junk bonds, although they have done that. And what it sounds like here is that a German court has now ruled saying that the European Central Bank cannot legally purchase some of the assets that it's purchased. And the EU is trying to decide, what are we going to do about this? Because Germany, being a larger European country, has more sway in the economics and politics of the European Union. And Germans in particular are a bit more sensitive to the issue of hyperinflation than other nations because they still remember what happened during the Weimar hyperinflation.
Oh, yeah.
So yeah.
So it looks like they're basically more wary about the central bank buying bonds, more so than the United States is, where the Federal Reserve is just sort of like, yeah, give me those bonds. Nom, 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 nom.
Yeah.
And mark my words, if I turn out to be wrong about this, fine, I'll admit it at the time. But I'm pretty sure before this crisis is over, the Fed will start actually purchasing stocks.
I wouldn't be surprised. I mean, I'm actually wouldn't be surprised if they're doing so already. I think I recall actually seeing something about that, but I don't remember the specifics, so don't quote me on that.
And of course, we talked about how last week the chairman of the Minneapolis Fed said basically negative interest rates, well, unlikely, are maybe. And which means that I think as the more desperate they get, they're just going to they're going to kick the can down the road as long as they possibly can. They'll start buying stocks. They'll even go to negative interest rates. Good for Germany, though, in as much as if they slow down the ECB's ability to purchase assets and expand their balance sheet, they might make the collapse come sooner, which I think if the European Union collapses before the United States, I'm sure the Fed and United States politicians will criticize them for not going to more drastic measures. But in reality, the sooner it is really in their best interest to just let the collapse happen, the sooner you let it happen, the faster everything will recover. The longer you delay the collapse, the worse it'll be and the longer it will take to recover.
It's the equivalent of you avoid getting hit by a car, only to get hit by a bus.
Pretty much. Now then, I am still following the chat. Looks like Servius is still trying to defend his point.
Okay, well, he's free to do so later in my Discord server. For the time being, we're done with that conversation.
Fair enough.
Elbedo says, have you heard that Mozambique defaulted this past week? No, I haven't, but I know a lot of small, like Lebanon and Pakistan and others, I know smaller countries are starting to default. And it's just kind of a foreshadowing of what is to come with these larger nations like the United States, the UK, Germany, and others.
Didn't Nazi Germany 2 Electric Boogaloo in South America, didn't they default?
I don't think they've defaulted yet, but they're pretty close.
All right.
Maybe.
Which country is that?
Argentina. Argentina. No, I was going to say Argentina.
Argentina. Okay, I haven't heard anything about that specifically. Here, let me check.
I'm pretty sure they're close. I'm pretty sure they defaulted. But then again, like I've heard that they default a lot. Like this is their 7th default or something.
Which is funny, considering wasn't there a time when people used the phrase "rich as an Argentine"?
This is the first time I've heard that phrase.
Okay. I believe there was a time in Argentina's history when it was in fact quite prosperous.
Probably.
Okay, just Googling it. I've got several articles. The Buenos Aires Times, Reuters. Let's see what Reuters has to say here. Published yesterday. Argentina's creditors make counteroffers as debt restructuring deadline nears. In Buenos Aires, Argentina received 3 new counteroffers from creditors late on Friday as the South American nation races to strike a deal to restructure $65 billion in foreign debt and avoid a default by the deadline at the end of next week. The economy ministry said in a statement it was analyzing the offers and their implications for restoring the sustainability of public debt. So no, it looks like they haven't defaulted yet, but they will by the end of this week if something isn't done. Pumpkin Row, thank you for the second super chat. What is your opinion on the idea of negative IQ?
I mean, we've already observed it several times.
Yeah,
typically
communism.
I mean, I can make a lot of very hot takes right now. I'm just saying. I'm going to avoid pissing off the audience, though. I'll save that for another time.
Yes.
I'm just going to go ahead and read this definition of negative IQ from Urban Dictionary. An invisible beam emitted from the brains of stupid people that make you feel dumber when you approach them.
That's about it.
Well, yeah, I've observed that several times. And oftentimes it manifests as you withholding your full power level because you don't want to upset them.
Right.
That's usually how it feels for me.
Just really quick, I want to answer JC Armitage. He was asking, do we think that we're on the verge of World War III? My answer to that would be no. At the rate that countries are at the rate that economies around the world are pretty much dying, it would be very foolhardy of any nation at this point to declare war on anyone else. And I mean, if we weren't already on the verge of collapse, that's definitely what would put it over the edge. So I don't think that we're on the verge of anything like that.
And I would say war over the past 2 decades is what has brought many of these nations as bad into debt as they have. It's a common misconception that war is good for the economy. War is good for certain players who are not actually involved in the war. But as the broken window fallacy demonstrates, war cannot make a nation more prosperous. Destruction does not create wealth, and diverting resources towards causing destruction certainly doesn't create wealth. So yeah, with all the world economies in the current state that they are, it would be absolutely stupid for a nation to go to war. Although what I will say, armed conflict is not out of the realm of possibility, especially when the global collapse comes. You can bet that nations around the world will be using their militaries to try and consolidate control of supply chains.
I strongly suspect that there could be war simply because, and this is something I read several years ago, so my memory won't be perfect, but that countries are actually much more likely to go to war during times of economic downturn than in times of prosperity.
Well, in as much as in an effort to seize resources from other countries.
It's never really about resources that these conflicts typically come about. Sure, there may be some things like, what are they called? Embargoes that take place before a war, but typically that is an act of aggression and, for lack of a better term, an act of war being inflicted upon a country that is otherwise not aggressing against foreign powers and foreign entities.
All right.
And as such, they're well, yeah, like during the United States went to war during the tail end of the Great Depression. Nazi Germany was not doing too well financially, even with their even in their recovery. You had World War One, which was started during a recession, if I recall correctly, and you can see several other things and several other similar indicators. I don't remember the details off the top of my head, but yeah, it's these could actually be very dangerous times.
Mm-hmm. Now, World War III. I guess all I can say there is I don't know, because World War One was kind of. They say World War One was brought about by all these secret alliances that were taking place amongst European nations. One nation went to war with another, which triggered a secret alliance, which triggered another secret alliance, and lo and behold, the whole world comes to war. Of course, it comes to an end, not really being resolved, only setting the stage for World War II to happen several decades later. But what would be the spark that would set off World War III?
It's impossible to say because typically these flashpoint events are vastly disproportionate to the actual cause. Like I believe World War II was not started by the invasion of Poland, but rather the actual war declaration began because Germany was being late on how many wooden poles they gave to their creditors. You had World War III that was almost started because a flock of geese showed up on a Soviet radar screen. They thought that they were American bombers. The only reason that World War III didn't start is because the person who was observing the radar looked at that and just said, "Hold on a second, guys. Let's be absolutely clear about this before we do anything." Oh, it's geese. Okay, false alarm. And what was it that started the War of Northern Aggression? It was disputes over how much money the Southern states, or rather the Confederacy owed the Union.
Right.
That's this was everything that happens, like all these flashpoint events. It could be as spectacular as an unprovoked military assault like Pearl Harbor, except that wasn't unprovoked, or it can be as mundane as a Tea Party in Boston.
Okay.
So, yeah, how things work. So, and what the flashpoint will be, I can't say, and I can't tell you how big or how little it'll be. But what I can guarantee you will happen is that it will set forward a series of events that will lead governments inexplicably and inexorably towards war. I'm not saying this is a good thing. In fact, quite the opposite. But I'm just saying, like, now are very, very dangerous times.
True.
And on that note, we have reached the top of the hour. So if you do end up getting another stimulus check, I highly recommend you purchase either precious metals or cryptocurrency, or at least get your hands on some real resources. Because as we've been saying again and again, it's not too late yet, but it will be soon. Get your money out of currency, because if you're saving it in the bank and are counting on it to cover your expenses, it ain't going to do so for much longer. I'm sure we'll be back next week. I'm sure there'll be plenty more to discuss. Until then, live strong, be free, and that is my 2 cents. Take it for what it's worth.